So I'm calling this pre-budgeting. And so what is this? So at JMU, the Office of Sponsored Programs Administrative Services, that helps you with budget creation. And if you look at our webpage, it says, oh, when you're ready to create your budget, reach out. And by reach out, that means complete the interest form on the homepage, and we'll ask you for basic information about what program you're applying to, who you're collaborating with, all of that kind of information. But in terms of what does it mean to be ready to create your budget? And that's what today is about. Because our grant specialists in the Office of Sponsored Programs Administrative Services are really good at helping you take a list of the things that you need and turning it into a line item budget of the sort that you have to submit with your proposal. That means that you need to come in with a list of what you actually need to spend the grant money on. And in addition to that, because, plans always change, what's a high priority thing that you absolutely positively need this in order to do your project? And what's maybe a lower priority? Now, it's always nice when people bring us a draft budget, but that's totally optional. The key thing is that list. I think there's kind of this gap between you've done all this work to get your narrative in place of what your project is, what research you're going to do, when we're talking about the NSF, what your broader impacts are as well. And you have that grand vision of your research, but then there's also the actually getting your budget, your list together so you can make the budget. And so today we're just going to focus on that list. Okay. Feel free to interrupt with questions. I do try and cut questions out when we put these recorded trainings online. Okay. So that's the goal. That's what I'm calling pre-budgeting. And like I said, we've never run this sort of training before, so hopefully it's useful. If it's not, if it can be improved, let me know, and we will rethink it for the future. Okay, so when it comes to pre-budgeting, the thing that I think to keep in mind is this question of what do you need to do the project well? Okay. And so the first thing is to do the project. Everything you put in your budget, you're going to have to explain in the budget justification why it's necessary to accomplishing the project you've proposed. So just because you have kind of room in the budget to throw in another conference travel or another piece of equipment or something, unless you can tie it back to the project you've proposed, it's not going to fly. Now, when I say the project, remember that the project take account of its breadth. That's not just kind of the literal nuts and bolts of the research, but also the dissemination of that research. Any broader impacts, community outreach type events that you're also putting forward in your project. And if there's any required training for you and the staff, other staff to do this work, that's part of the project. The second thing to keep in mind is that last word, well. So when you do your budget justification, it has to be reasonable, it has to be necessary. Sometimes people really get hung up on that word necessary and they're like, well, I don't really have to have that. Don't overinterpret that word necessary. They want to see that you have a realistic sense of what it'll take to do the project well. They want to fund good work. They want you to do the work that you're proposing well. So that's the question to keep in mind. And I think how I'm going to organize this is just going through some categories of costs so that hopefully by thinking through these categories of costs, it'll help you put together a budget or that list to get turned into the line item budget. I'm just going to say at this stage, you don't need to think about what the estimated costs will be. Just, yes, I need that. No, I don't need that. Here's what would be nice to have. Here's what I absolutely have to have. Okay. Sound good? Okay, I'm getting some nods. Okay. So the very first line on any budget is always personnel costs. Okay. So who is going to work on this project? Okay. So the first category to think about in there is yourself and any other PIs. Now, this is an NSF career working group. There aren't other PIs on NSF career, but you come to other NSF proposals, you can be thinking of other PIs as well. For the NSF, they generally aren't going to allow you to reassign your normal research time as a faculty member to work on this project. Other funders might. But are you going to be working on this project more than your normal research time? What does that mean? Summertime. If you are instructional faculty here at JMU, your contract runs for sponsored program purposes 9 months. And so you can request by JMU rules up to 3 months of summer pay for working on a project. When we say personnel costs, that also includes course releases. That's a type of reassigned time in which you are taking time where you would be teaching and devoting it to um, your sponsored program. There's other reassigned time. There's also a possibility of overload time, but summer and course releases are kind of the normal ones. And just so you know, the NSF normally restricts the PIs to 2 months of effort per year. Okay. And that's combining summertime and course releases. Okay. So that's kind of the first thing to keep in mind. Do you need to pay yourself? Do you need to pay any other co-PIs if you have them? But besides yourself, you might have students. Those could be graduate students or undergraduate students in which you might want to pay them. That could also be full-time researchers. For an NSF proposal, a lot of times, if it's an involved project, people start thinking about the possibility of having, here we see more post-baccalaureate students who have their bachelor's degree. There's also postdocs. We don't get as many of them here at JMU. That's something to think about, especially if you have a large number of students. You might need someone to supervise and mentor them. Less so with NSF Career, but as with some other programs, we do see that they might be complicating enough to require a project director, and that would be another personnel cost that you would need to include. So these are kind of things to think of, things to keep in mind, kind of as you're creating your list. Yes, I want 2 undergraduate students. Yes, I want a course release. Yes, I want to post back, or maybe no. If you actually want to go beyond that, estimate costs, we have these budgeting basics videos that I will put in the email that I send out after this. The only reason I mention these is NSF, does have informal and sometimes a formal hard cap on what they will fund. And so if you're adding especially full-time positions, they can add up and be fairly expensive fairly quickly. So if you need to come up with a rough estimate, these will help you, but you absolutely don't need to have that before going into OSP with your kind of wish list. If you're going through the NSF categories, the next one is fringe costs. That's not something to worry about as you're making your list because that just depends on what you put into personnel costs. So you can just absolutely skip fringe costs when you're coming up with the sort of wish list to bring to OSP. When you have a grant specialist, they will work with you to figure out what the fringe costs are, set entirely by your personnel decisions. Okay. So that's the first big category to think about on your list, your personnel costs. Let me pause and say, any questions on personnel costs? That's a great question. So when you say to the NSF, please pay me money, you have to associate to an amount of time that you're working on the grant. And effort in sponsored programs lingo is just an amount of time, 1 month of effort, 2 weeks of effort, something like that. Okay. So there is a procedure, it varies a little bit college by college, that says one course, corresponds to this much effort, say 0.9 person months, so 0.9 months of effort. That is a little bit different college by college, so we would need to sit down and work with you for your college what it actually is. So then we would say, okay, you're requesting a course release, let's say that's 0.9 person months of effort. Then you could usually request up to 1.1 summer months of effort. Okay. The NSF generally won't pay more than 2 months of effort per PI per year. Okay. So the NSF generally would not let you say, please pay me for 3 summer months plus a course release. The NSF generally cuts you off at 2. You can make the case to go higher. So that's why I said generally here, or normally is what I actually wrote. Because you can make a case that like this project requires that much more additional work and they should do that. Um, this is a loose rule of the NSF, but it is just something to keep in mind.
Thank you.
Yeah, so JMU will let you go up to 3 summer months, and then the number of course releases that from JMU's perspective is whatever your AUH and Dean will approve. NSF though generally has this list. So I start with personnel costs because that's usually, or maybe not usually, but often one of the biggest categories. The next one that kind of comes up is actual stuff, especially if you're in the sciences. What stuff do you need? Microscopes, whatever, to do your experiment. And when people start putting together their budget pretty quickly, they can get into the weeds because there's a distinction between equipment and materials and supplies. But this stage, when you're coming up with your wish list, you don't need to worry about that. Your grant specialist will help you figure out, does this count as equipment or does this count as materials and supplies? You know, that's not your concern here. It's just what stuff do you need? This is usually one of the easier categories in terms of PIs generally have a sense of, well, I need this material, you know, this sample or whatever to go do my experiment. But I do want to say, make sure to be thorough. You know, if you are purchasing some sort of telescope for public outreach, do you need eyepieces? We here in OSP are not subject matter experts in order to be able to catch it if you like order one piece of equipment, but forget to order all of the accessories that you need to use it. The other thing that I kind of want to highlight is with the equipment materials, don't just think of like the physical objects, but think more broadly. And some of these broader ones might go elsewhere and other categories, but like data storage. Are you going to need some sort of either local or cloud-based data storage for your work? Um, Okay. Questions about that? Cool. The other next one is travel. Okay. And so when it comes to travel, I will say this is one of the ones that we get the most pushback from sponsors on. So it also sometimes tends to be a little bit of a slush fund where people just throw numbers around in there. When it comes to travel, you're going to need to justify and explain your travel. Not necessarily all of the details of how you calculated it, although that's always good, but why do you need travel to do your project and where do you plan on going? The one that we see most often is conference travel, especially with the NSF. They're going to want to see some sort of broader impact, which means disseminating your results to the broader community. That's part of broader impacts. So conference travel is very common, but also travel to visit collaborators, or alternatively for your collaborators to come here. In some cases, you might need to travel to collect data or some sort of other actually doing the experiment. You might need to go somewhere. So think about those categories of travel. When you're doing your travel calculations, think about who all needs to travel. If you're going to a conference, should you bring students? Is that going to be part of your mentorship plan for how you have broader impacts by students developing career skills? Um, so you don't need to have a broken down, detailed thing of what the travel is. Although you should expect when it comes time to do your line item budget, your grant specialist will probably work with you, but you'll have to come up with some of the information for an estimate. Your grant specialist isn't going to know what a reasonable cost is for conference registration fees, for example. If you want to get an estimate, again, the link to the budgeting basics videos will be there. But you don't need that at the wish list stage. You just need to think about, I want to go to this conference. I want to take 2 students. I'm collaborating with someone at this university, and I think it'd be great if we could get together for a week each year to work in person. I need to take my actual sample over to this piece of equipment that is at this other university. That sort of travel list is something to keep in mind. Okay. Questions about travel? Okay. So that's travel. That's often another big category, kind of regardless of what type of grant is going in. The last one is a little bit of a catch-all if you're looking at the budget line, but that means that things that go in here often get forgotten about. Okay. Other direct costs. So what are things that show up in other direct costs? Depending on your field, you might need to cover publication costs. I want to flag this because for new grants, the NSF says that publications have to be uploaded into their public access repository immediately, no embargo. And so there are some publishers, some journals that if you want to have it open access or in a public repository right away without waiting 12 months or 6 months or whatever, there's an extra fee. Okay. So do pay attention because you can write that into your grant and say, okay, NSF, you're going to require me to upload my publications into your public repository as soon as they're published. That means that I need an extra $200 per publication or whatever to cover the open access charge. Um, and that's one that kind of can sneak up, I think, on researchers. Um, I'm just going to throw these out here because they come up frequently, although not so much on NSF Career Awards. If you're collaborating with another university, there might be sub-awards. Now, NSF does have collaborative proposals instead of the sub-award structure, which works much, much smoother. But that's something to keep in mind. If you have collaborators, are you going to have to share some of the funds with them? If you need to hire a consultant for some reason, for example, if you need some sort of external evaluation of your program, consultancy fees sometimes go in here. Remember to budget for them. If you have unusual computing costs, those go in other direct costs. Something that we've seen come up more and more is needing access to a secure environment, or time on a high performance cluster for your analyses. Don't forget those costs, even though there's not like a direct line kind of for them. Um, Depending on what sort of research you're doing, you might have human subjects research participants that you might need some sort of incentive, some sort of small gift card or something for participating in the research. Again, remember to budget that. It's much easier to put that in at the beginning than try to scramble up the costs later. I'll just stop and say questions about these. This is not an exhaustive list. I will say if you are stuck on a plane reading through the NSF regulations for some of these is a lot of fun for things that you might not have thought about like what happens if you need to charter an airplane to do your research? How should you put that in your budget? So your grant specialists have seen a lot. They are experts. Don't hesitate to throw anything strange at them. Um, but I just kind of want to get those you thinking about these categories. There is one line on the NSF budget that, for the most part, you don't need to be thinking about, and that's participant support costs. I would say that most of the time when we see people coming in saying, I need money for participant support costs, it actually belongs somewhere else. Because this is not payment to survey participants, student workers, etc. That goes in other places on the budget. And this is a participant support cost is something like a stipend, a travel allowance, participant supplies, registration fees that you pay on behalf of participants or trainees, but not employees. And they have to be connected to conferences, workshops, seminars, or training projects. These don't cover speaker honoraria. They don't cover transportation costs for your collaborators to come visit you. So most of the time when people are saying they need money and participant support costs, that's part of why we like you to have a list because most of the time that's not the right spot for it. Where do we actually see participant support costs come up? So let's say a situation in your broader impacts where you say, I'm going to bring some high school teachers to JMU's campus and we're going to have some sort of discussion and some training on my research topic. Those high school teachers, they're not employees. They are also not research uh, subjects, human subjects participants. So those would be participants for participant support costs. So if you were paying those teachers a stipend for coming, maybe you're providing them lunch, maybe you're covering part of their travel costs. That's an example of legitimate participant support costs. And again, that's something that you can be thinking about as you come up with your broader impacts if you're holding some sort of event. Um, Maybe you don't have to just rely on high school teachers taking a Saturday morning to come to your thing, but you actually will give them a small stipend. The other case where we see participant support costs come up is REU students. That's not relevant for career, but REUs are a wonderful program for getting undergraduate students from campuses around the country coming to JMU to participate in student research in the summer. Okay, questions about participant support costs? Again, this is something where come up with your wish list and your grants specialist will help you figure out which category it goes into. Okay. The other thing that you don't need to worry about, as part of your list, but should be aware of, is indirect costs. So NSF grants, always count as organized research in terms of what our IDC rate is. So that means it's going to be 52%, unless it happens the majority of the work is off campus, then our off-campus rate is 26%. Um, just a reminder, that does not mean that over half of the grant funds goes to indirect costs, because what you request of the sponsor will be your direct costs and then plus 52% of the modified total direct costs. Modified total direct costs, that ignores a few categories. You don't need to worry about that. But if you are trying to estimate your costs for some reason, it's important to take into account the IDC that pays for things like keeping the lights on, where you're doing your research, library access, all of the sort of stuff that enables JMU to be a place to do research. Basically, your grant specialist will talk to you about that, but on campus versus off campus, you need to think about all of the project work that you are proposing. So that can include data collection, but also data analysis, writing your papers, any sort of broader impacts that you're having. So, for example, for NSF Career, people often talk about proposing some sort of course development and offering that course based on their research area. So that would include, if that's part of your project, broadly construed, that would be included there. So if you think about absolutely all of the work that's being done on this project, and think about the time that it takes, is most of that taking place on campus, or is most of that taking place off campus? And the one tricky thing here is on and off campus, most of the time, like if you have remote work arrangements or something, you're going to be doing your analysis, but you work from home, 2 days a week. I know with faculty, it's a little bit flexible. That still kind of counts as on campus because you're like supposed to be working on campus, but you have special accommodations to work at home. So you can't just be like, oh yes, I am, my background is theoretical physics. So I can't be like, I am a theoretical physicist. I like to work in my pajamas. Give me the off-campus rate. Because you're still using your campus provided laptop, logging into the library remotely, that sort of thing. Off-campus work would be like I'm going into a local school and running a project there. I am doing field work, taking data on birds in, I don't know, Idaho, something like that. And then you would want to look at it and say, okay, how much of the work is being done off campus in Idaho? How much of the work is being done on campus? And the nice thing is it goes by the majority. So if 51% of the work is off campus, you use the off campus rate. If 51% of the work is on campus, you use the on campus rate. You don't have to try and break it up and this specific percentage is here and this specific percentage is there. We are not subject matter experts, so like obviously, short of you saying I'm studying this bird and it lives only in Idaho, we don't know where the work is going to be done. So it's not like we're going to make this decision completely without communicating with you. I will say usually the off-campus ones are fairly clear. So,
Yeah.
sure. So this is an NSF grant. So
Yeah.
NSF uses what's known as our NECRA, our Negotiate Indirect Cost Agreement.
Oh, okay.
So every few years, JMU has to negotiate with the federal government. Ours
Hmm.
runs through Health and Human Services, where we lay out these are our real costs for doing research on campus.
Okay.
This is, they track the electricity to the buildings, maintenance to the buildings,
Hmm.
that sort of thing. They also look at, for example, HR costs. If you're hiring a student, their verification of employment eligibility is being handled by JMU's HR. Um, Similarly, costs having to do with managing the grant funds and making sure that they are being spent in accordance with all of those federal regulations. So JMU sits down, presents to the federal government, these are our costs for doing research. And obviously, some of those apply if you're on campus, some of those don't. That's why we have different rates. We also have different rates for like public outreach. Types of work. Our full NECRA is on the Office of Sponsored Programs webpage if you want to see it. So that is where that comes from. And for the most part, not always, but for the most part, for any government funded sponsored program, they're going to follow the NECRA. After all, we're negotiating it with the government. When it comes to private funders, very often they will require us to use a lower indirect cost rate. And for the most part, OSP will respect the request of any funder that wants it lower, which is different than what you see at many R1s, where there's frequently some sort of policy um, or additional approval process if you're using a rate that's lower than your negotiate rate, because that negotiate rate is based on real costs to JMU. It's not just JMU being like, oh, I think I would like this much money. And so when we do sponsored programs at a rate lower than our NECRA rate, JMU really is kicking in extra money. That's called unrecovered cost and unrecovered indirect costs. And so basically, JMU is subsidizing part of the project if we use a number lower than the negotiated rate. Um, and so if it says 10%, then that's what we're going to go with. The thing that is always a bit tricky with foundations is whether it's 10% of the total or this rate, indirect cost rate is we take the costs that you've given us, subtract out a few categories, you don't need to worry about that, and then would take like say 10% of that and then add that to get the total. So in terms of math, let's say for purposes, you had a 50% um, indirect cost rate and you were requesting $100. Then the IDC would be 50% of 100, that would be 50. And so you would request $150 total. $50 of that would be indirect costs. So that's a third. Um, if that's confusing, the Washington Post actually got it wrong when the federal government was trying to have these lawsuits about the NECRA rate.
Okay.
Um,
Oh,
so it effectively subsidizes it. So that
yeah.
indirect costs, it comes to the university,
Hmm.
and I believe, don't quote me if I got this wrong, I believe
Yeah.
30% goes
Hmm.
to facilities,
Hmm.
to, keep the lights on.
Right. Right. Right.
Um, 30% comes here to Ready, the division I sit in, and
Hmm.
that helps to pay for the people who manage the drawdown requests to
Yep.
actually get the money here to the university, that makes sure you're following all of the Fly America Act rules and all the other rules,
Hmm.
that maintain the invoices in case we're audited and send them off to the sponsor. So all those things that you don't have to do, those people's salaries get paid out of the indirect costs. So
Got it.
that is where another 30% goes.
Hmm.
30%, I believe, goes to your department,
Hmm.
and that is supposed to cover costs to the department, administrative support, and that sort of thing. And
Hmm.
then 10%, I believe, goes to the college because the college also has some administrative work in
Yeah.
one of
Totally.
the grants. So it doesn't come to you,
Hmm.
necessarily
Yeah.
to help you do your project. But it kind of takes care of all those invisible things where you don't have to pay someone to come empty your trash can. You don't have to
Right.
pay an electricity bill. You don't have to pay for your library journal subscriptions.
Hmm.
That all comes out of that. Especially large foundations, the majority of foundations, when they say indirect costs, they mean the same, they mean it calculated the same way as the federal government. You do occasionally come across foundations that say something about like no more than 10% of the total can go to indirect costs, and then we're always fudging
Yes,
it
yes.
around. The other thing, just to be clear on, is there is a slight difference between total direct costs and modified total direct costs. Um, and that has to do with circling back to, we talked about equipment versus materials and supply. Equipment generally is not included when you calculate the modified total direct costs because you're just taking that money or buying a piece of equipment. It doesn't really count. Same thing with participant support costs because that money is going to supporting people who are elsewhere. Subawards are a little bit complicated. Part of it usually counts and part of it usually doesn't. So that word modified is in there for a reason, but again, this is coming up with your list. So I just kind of want to flag as indirect costs, as I said at the top. This is something your grant specialist will take care of, helping you figure out what that is, what's included in the modified total, what's not. If you have some sort of lower cap from a foundation, figuring out that cap, whether it works the same way as the standard IDC rate or whether it's a percentage of the total. That's all things, that's why we have grant specialists to help with
Right.
that. But I do want, and I'm happy to take these questions. We're not short on time at all. But I don't want to overwhelm anyone with you don't need to know this coming in.
When Lawrence said the university subsidized the unrecovered IDC, it's just effectively, it's not university is going to give additional money. It's just university is unable to recover all of its indirect costs.
Yep.
So no one is going to pay for it additionally from your college or from your department or anywhere else from the university. Just wanted to clarify that.
If you have a program that requires cost share, unrecovered indirect costs, if they apply, can also be included towards cost share, but that is not relevant for pretty much all NSF grants. There are very few NSF grants that require cost sharing, so.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for that.
Okay. Other questions? Okay, so hopefully this has given you some categories. I'm going to share these slides. I'm going to cut out Q&A and post this on our website. So hopefully you have now the categories. You have some ideas of a list of this is what I need. These are the people I need to pay for doing work on the grant. This is the equipment that I need. This is the travel that I need. This is the other random stuff that I need. You've got a list. So what do you need to do? Well, that's the point when you have that list ready of reaching out to a grant specialist who will then help you associate numbers with everything on that list. How much are they actually going to cost? Turn it into the line item budget in the format that NSF wants it. It's a good idea to like have a rough prioritization of those things, so that as rubber meets the road and line items and indirect costs come in, usually it's more expensive than you think it will be. Rarely does it go the other way. In case you have to drop something to be under the maximum to kind of know where your space is. If you need to travel somewhere to actually get your data, that might be a little bit different than dropping a conference travel that maybe you could present virtually at. If you're feeling bold, feel free to make a draft budget. OSP has templates. We have those videos on there. But if you're not feeling bold, that is perfectly fine too. The thing that you need to bring to the grant specialist is that list. Okay. And so that is all I've got. Come back April 3rd after spring break, after you're all feeling reinvigorated to learn how to go from this list to the actual line item budget. So.